We're in for an amazing time as Imagic makes its debut on Atari Archive. While there are a few different third-party publishers making and publishing games for the VCS as of April 1982, up to this point only Activision could truly be considered the one making software that truly equals or exceeds Atari's own standards. This isn't too surprising, as Activision was founded by former Atari VCS developers, the best ones the company had on staff in the late 1970s, and they were continually honing their craft after striking out on their own. And the success of Activision inspired another group of Atari game developers to do the same, leading to the birth of Imagic. Imagic was founded by 9 people, including Atari developers Rob Fulop, Bob Smith, and Dennis Koble. Fulop and Smith were 2 of Atari's solid game developers at the time, Fulop being responsible for the home conversions of Space Invaders to the 8-bit computers and Missile Command and Night Driver to the VCS, while Smith had developed video pinball before spending time on the ill-fated Super Stella hardware platform. Koble, on the other hand, had spent several years as an Atari coin-op developer, working on games such as Sprint 1 and 2, Avalanche, and Dominoes before being shuffled over to consumer development, becoming the manager after George Simcock left that position 2 months later. While he was there, he wrote a few programs for the Atari 8-bit computers that eventually came out under the Atari Program Exchange. And in his final months at Atari, he delegated some of his management workload to Smith as he planned for his own departure. Additionally, from the Atari side, they were joined by Bill Grubb, a former vice president of marketing and sales. In a January 1983 interview with Video Games, Grubb said that he resigned in January 1981 from Atari because he was tired of the big corporate life and he wanted to strike out on his own. He started New West Marketing, working with companies such as Activision and Mattel, when Koble approached him about his own interest in starting his own company. Koble felt that Atari had changed from the company he had enjoyed working at, as he stated in his interview with Kay Savetz on the Antic podcast in 2018, and wanted to do something different. He started writing down an idea for Atari to fund a small group to serve as a skunkworks, but realized he knew nothing about marketing and sales, which led to him calling Grubb about his idea, where Grubb floated the idea of splitting this off into a new company. Not long after, Grubb talked with Jim Goldberger, an engineer with Mattel, who wanted to echo the Activision model but for Intellivision games. The 3 of them determined that they could work together, and after raising funds from Bank of America and other venture capitalists, recruited a few more developers from Atari and Mattel, who then left over the summer. Imagic officially was formed in October. Thanks to Grubb's connections with Magnavox, he was able to secure a favorable agreement to avoid any video game patent lawsuits. To avoid any kind of legal entanglements with Atari like those Activision had to deal with, Grubb said Imagic chose to have all their hardware reverse engineering done by an outside consultant. Grubb at the time announced Imagic would publish its first games for VCS in the spring, with Intellivision software to follow in the summer and fall. These first 3 games, Rob Fulop's Demon Attack, Bob Smith's Star Voyager, and Dennis Koble's Trick Shot, all debuted at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show to start shipping March 17th, and by all indications they started reaching stores in April, accompanied by a $2 million ad blitz. The first of those 3 games we'll be looking at proved to be the company's hottest seller. Demon Attack is a space-based shooter where you battle waves of alien creatures, a genre that is just starting to take off on the VCS in 1982, following the releases of Space Jockey and Space Chase earlier in the year. Demon Attack is more refined in terms of enemy variety and behavior than those games, likely owing to developer Rob Fulop's own inspiration for it, Namco's Galaxian, published by Midway in the US in early 1980. Fulop has given several interviews over the years about this game and his part in Imagic's founding. In his 2019 interview with the website Paleotronic, Fulop said he decided to leave Atari after receiving a coupon for a free turkey as a bonus instead of cash after finishing Missile Command, which was published in May 1981. At the same time, he learned Koble was leaving the company to start his own business and asked to join them, abandoning an in-development original game in the process to start fresh at Imagic. Once there, he said, he was motivated to make a game that would make Atari cry, and regret how they treated him with the turkey coupon. Notably, while Fulop recognized that Imagic's primary competition would be Activision, which, as he put it, was staffed by the A-list VCS developers, they weren't really a consideration for him at that point, focused as he was at one-upping Atari. What he settled on was a vertical shooter with alien attackers that would peel off and attack the player in various ways. In a 1993 interview with the Atari 2600 Connection newsletter, Fulop stated that Demon Attack was inspired very directly by Galaxian. The Paleotronic interview says Galaga, but that game did not debut until around October 1981, and therefore couldn't have been a major factor for the Imagic game. The idea of the game was hitting players with new things to see in battle as they got further into it. Sure enough, alien designs shift as players make their way further into the game, and as do their attack behaviors. Initially, the demons simply shoot at players, but as you progress, some will split in two when shot and eventually begin exhibiting dive-bombing behaviors where they try to ram the player. Demon Attack is one of the earliest games on the VCS that didn't require the use of graph paper to draw out the object art that then had to be worked out in hex code and typed in assembly by hand, Fulop said in his 1993 interview. Instead, it used a custom VCS sprite animation program written by Fulop for the Atari 800 known simply as Move, alongside a utility developed by Bob Smith that could squirt that data straight into the VCS's assembly code and result in a sprite object that looked identical to what was drawn on the 800. Fulop considered this a huge step up from the methodology he had used at Atari, and which was in use at Activision at the time as well, which he said at minimum would introduce 2 errors per 8x8 character. The visual design of the monsters in Demon Attack is one of the game's strongest points. It seems that it was a vital component from the beginning. This is a very pretty game by VCS standards, even if it's not as outwardly colorful as Activision's latest titles like Barnstorming. Outside of Mattel, Imagic was also one of the first gaming companies to hire a graphic artist to work with programmers. Michael Becker joined the company late in Demon Attack's development and designed one of the demon sprites using Smith's design utility. According to Becker's appearance during the Imagic panel at the 2004 Classic Gaming Expo, he was hired to help with package designs, but since he could also do graphic work, that he was introduced to these artistic tools that Smith and Fulop were using, such as Move and its counterpart Draw. He said he was designing animation steps for these little 8x8 sprites using the joystick button to move it along step by step to ensure it animated properly, allowing the designers, in this case Fulop, to do the line-by-line color changes on the VCS itself. In his 2019 interview, Fulop mentions the swooping motion of the attackers being something he struggled to get just right, ultimately leaving it in a dissatisfying state to finish the rest of the game, before coming back at the end and continuing to tweak it until the movement felt organic. He said this ran right up against the deadline their marketing folks at Imagic had set, and that he had to fight to keep working on the game until he was satisfied in its last month of development, going so far as to swipe the backup disk of the source code from the company so they couldn't ship it without him. The marketing folks weren't happy, and Fulop said the situation got very heated at times, but the end result was well worth it. In all, he estimated Demon Attack from start to finish took about 8 months. Demon Attack features several interesting game options, most of which are for 1 or 2 players. There's the basic Demon Attack game where you fight increasingly more aggressive enemies, tracer shot game modes where your bullets follow your own movements along the bottom of the screen, and Advanced Demon Attack, which starts you further in the game, around the second loop of aliens essentially. In 2-player games, the action shifts over to the other after each wave is completed, presumably to keep the VCS from having to remember the positions of all the demons for each player. Perhaps the most interesting game modes are the 2 alternating co-op modes, where players share the base and control shifts every 4 seconds. If a player is destroyed, their partner gains an extra 500 points, which means that even if you're largely in sync, it can be personally beneficial to set yourself up to die right before the control switches. These feature standard play and tracer shots, respectively. The difficulty switches adjust whether or not the demons are even more aggressive than usual. The game starts off somewhat challenging but fairly manageable and ramps up steadily over the course of the ensuing waves. Once you get a feel for how the demons move and attack, you can be forgiven for expecting this to be fairly smooth sailing, especially given how the game awards you with an extra life every wave you clear without taking a hit, up to 6 in reserve. The different types of alien graphics add a certain appeal to wanting to get further until you inevitably loop back to the original demons. But as they get faster and more aggressive and gain new attack methods, such as firing lasers and dive-bombing you after splitting, the game shows its teeth, and it becomes much more difficult to earn those extra lives safely. The tracer shots are a bit of a double-edged sword, since they can help hit demons that are flying high, but force you into dangerous positions to tag the ones that are actually firing at you near the bottom of the screen. As for the co-op mode, it actually works pretty well for such a simple concept. Control doesn't shift often enough to make things too chaotic, and the game's pace allows you to react to taking your turn relatively easily as long as you're paying enough attention. Imagic had a reputation for producing challenging games for more hardcore audiences, and Demon Attack absolutely sets that tone. But there are strategies to keep your session going. Since only 3 demons, or 6 mini-demons, can be on screen at a time, and only the bottommost demon actively fires on you, you can use this to your advantage to wipe out all the reserve demons while dodging fire from the only one that will threaten you. Or, alternately, you can target the demon that shoots back and then try and destroy the others before they can move into bombing range. Once demons start splitting, only one of the 2 will fire at you, and after destroying one of them, the other will try to ram you, which is certainly one way to get a ceasefire on the demon's part. Effective demon management is the key to high scores in this one. It's also worth mentioning Demon Attack's incredible box art. As mentioned, Becker was hired on in part to design packaging. During his panel appearance in 2004, Becker remarked that several kinds of box designs were tested with a panel of kids, with what would become their trademark silver box nearly stolen by one of the kids because they liked it so much. Which of course was the most expensive box option they had, but it made Imagic games really shine. The ad agency Bob Jacobs had designed the boxes for Demon Attack, Trick Shot, and Star Voyager by the time Becker joined in early 1982, inspired by the compositing effects made popular by Star Wars. Becker said he recognized the rubber dinosaurs with the rockets glued to their backs, and when he left the company, he managed to rescue one of the dinosaurs and gave it to Fulop. The distinct Imagic cartridges themselves were designed by Jim Smith, according to Koble and Smith's panel at the 2016 Portland Retro Gaming Expo, who had previously worked at Atari. Demon Attack was rare for a shooting game of its time in that it had a definitive ending, at least the first run of cartridges does. After 84 waves, the game would halt, which Fulop said was intentional as he didn't expect anyone to ever finish all 84 waves of the game he'd programmed in. Well, 2 days after copies started hitting store shelves, he said in his 1993 interview, they'd heard that a kid had managed to reach the end of the game. Imagic wrote a letter to send to people who had done so while having Fulop adjust one bit in the game program for future print runs that allowed for endless play, though the game's difficulty still topped out at the 84th. And there were certainly future print runs. Demon Attack was Imagic's best-selling game on the VCS. According to the New York Times, industry estimates circa November 1982 put its overall sales at about 2 million copies by that point. And in his 2017 interview with Scott Stilphen, Koble believed it ended closer to an eye-popping 3 or 4 million, which would put it in the same realm as VCS heavyweights such as Pitfall, Frogger, and Asteroids. Video Game Update indicates it was their 3rd best-selling game for the year after Pitfall and Pac-Man on the VCS. Fulop received royalty checks for copies sold, and remarked in his 2019 interview that a 25-year-old insecure geek receiving 6-figure checks did a lot to change his worldview. He felt that he'd succeeded in showing up Atari as he'd set out to do, and while he didn't have that same drive for his next game, Cosmic Arc, it's undeniable he made Imagic a real name off the bat. Demon Attack made its way to a variety of other platforms in the ensuing months. Demon Attack arrived for the Intellivision as part of Imagic's first wave of releases on that platform that October, and was a greatly enhanced conversion. In addition to having more graphical bells and whistles, the Intellivision port included a mothership stage after fighting off enough waves of enemies. By all accounts, this version reviewed well and sold well for Imagic. In March 1983, Imagic became the first company to publish third-party games for the American Odyssey 2 with a remarkably solid version of Demon Attack. While the graphics aren't quite as impressive as those on competing platforms, the game plays pretty much as you'd want it to, as remarked on by the reviewer at Electronic Fun with Computers and Games. This version was written by Dave Johnson, who also wrote the Qbert-esque Quick Step for the VCS. Demon Attack also showed up on a variety of computer platforms, including the Atari 400, the Commodore 64, the TI-99-4A, and the TRS-80 color computer, making it probably Imagic's most accessible game at the time. If you owned a popular game system or computer, odds are you could play Demon Attack on it. Atari, true to form at the time, filed a lawsuit against Imagic over Demon Attack at the end of November, alleging that the game, which had been on the market for more than half a year by that point, infringed on its Centauri's arcade game Phoenix, to which Atari had licensed the home rights. This lawsuit was short-lived, however. By early January, the two companies had settled out of court, and though the terms weren't revealed, Demon Attack continued to be stocked on the shelves. In his 1993 interview, Fulop said the lawsuit came about because of the Intellivision version of Demon Attack, not the VCS one, as that version had the aforementioned mothership stage, and contemporary reporting from Game Magazine suggests that this was indeed the case. No other versions of Demon Attack include the mothership, so it's possible this was a component to the settlement. The lawsuit did force Imagic to amend its initial public offering text, which ended up being rendered moot after Atari's dismal quarterly report in December forced Imagic to cancel its IPO. The suffering video game industry ended up preventing the company from ever going public. Demon Attack was wildly praised for its day, winning Game of the Year from Billboard and the Archie Award for Home Console Video Game of the Year from Electronic Games. In their August 1982 review, the magazine calls it the strongest of Imagic's initial 3 offerings that has little going for it other than fantastic play value, ever-changing state-of-the-art visuals, and generally coin-op production values and superior packaging. They go on to praise the variety of demons, the intricacies to their attack patterns, and the clever co-op mode. Logical Gamer's reviewers were a bit split, with one praising the game in general, especially its co-op mode, while the other felt it was mildly disappointing compared to the packaging. In Space Gamer's July 1982 edition, the reviewer notes the 84th round cutoff and was irritated that the difficulty does not increase much past the 12th round, but nevertheless praises the challenge curve, the visuals, and recommends it to anyone playing Atari games. In the January video game update, later known as Computer Entertainer, they gave Imagic their Manufacturer of the Year award for 1982 due specifically to Demon Attack and 2 other games, Atlantis and Cosmic Arc. Imagic also earned the Most Consistently Innovative Company, but this was not specific to Demon Attack. In Joystick's December 1982 special edition featuring nothing but reviews and strategies for games, Demon Attack was called simply one of the best games on the market at the time. Timonosco mentioned Imagic's games in his April 9th roundup in the Capital Times, dubbing Demon Attack the best arcade-style game on the VCS at that time, and that these sights and sounds needed to be seen to be appreciated. In a twist, Demon Attack is one of 3 Imagic VCS games that were republished around February 1988 by Activision, alongside Koble's Atlantis and Smith's Moonsweeper. There are conflicting stories about how this came about, but what we do know for sure is that when Imagic closed in 1985, then CEO Bruce Davis retained the rights to all its games. Davis went to Activision in 1987, serving initially as the chief operating officer before becoming CEO, overseeing the company's tumultuous period under the Mediagenic name until it was bought out by Bobby Kotick in 1991 in a hostile takeover. From here, things get murky. Did Davis officially sell the Imagic catalog in whole or in part to Activision, or did he merely license it to his new employer? A 2005 interview Davis had with Retro Gaming Radio suggests he still owned the rights himself. Separately, in an Intellivisionaries podcast with the late Keith Robinson, he indicated that when Intellivision Productions was licensing third-party games from Activision for the Intellivision Rocks collection, Activision ensured that no Imagic games were mentioned by name in the contract. The 3 reissued Imagic VCS games showed up on the 2002 Activision Anthology collection, with the full Imagic VCS library appearing on the PC version the following year, so certainly Activision seemed at least confident enough that they could reissue them at the time. That Imagic trio also has shown up alongside various Activision games on the Atari Flashback console line. Only Davis and Activision's legal department really would know for sure who owns what, and I suspect the latter doesn't particularly care to dig into their archives without good reason. Star Voyager by the late Bob Smith is a first-person space game loosely inspired by Atari's computer game Star Raiders. Due to the blocky visuals of the VCS, Smith told me when we spoke in 2021 that he preferred working in first-person perspectives, and that approaching this game he really wanted to do a double-line resolution space game with growing enemies and a Stargate effect. Once Imagic's dev systems came in, which he described as in-circuit emulators, quite unlike Atari's funky systems, Smith got to work making his own unique take on a game type that hadn't really been attempted again on the platform since Bob Whitehead's Starship in 1977. As stated, this is a first-person space shooter. Your goal is to fly the titular Star Voyager through 7 star portals to rescue the capital starport, which is under siege by Zakhor's ships, according to the manual's brief background. Each Stargate is patrolled by Zakhoran ships that must be destroyed or evaded before you're clear to make it through. The Star Voyager itself only has a limited energy supply that is depleted when firing weapons or taking damage, while entering a portal will recharge your ship. Each portal passed through changes the color along the borders to indicate where you are. The number on the left of the indicators features the number of aliens destroyed, while the number on the right is the remaining energy reserves. The difficulty switches adjust the game's speed and whether or not you're attacking with torpedoes, which use less energy but are more difficult to aim, or lasers, which are instantaneous but use more energy. You can also select game modes to allow for 2 players, with a second player taking up weapon systems or, alternately, control of the enemy's ships. The manual has directions for determining your score, but otherwise the game itself doesn't track anything. Audio cues play a key part. 4 beeps indicate an enemy ship, while a short musical tune indicates a portal is approaching. Smith said he wanted to include a musical sting akin to the alien musical message from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but ran into problems as the VCS does not have a full note scale. As such, the finished game kind of has that then iconic tune, but it's not quite there. If you're coming to Star Voyager expecting a Star Raiders-esque experience, you're going to be disappointed, but for taking it on the more action-oriented take that it is, this is a pretty fun game. Enemy ships are aggressive, but in a way that thoughtful targeting can keep them in check, which is good because your ship is so slow it's difficult to actually avoid enemy fire. Instead, the smart approach is to lean into their shots to shoot them down, as this will use significantly less energy. You also want to keep an eye on where the blinking portal is located in your sensor on the bottom of the screen. Your slow turning speed means that if it's not already relatively near center, you're liable to miss it and have to fight your way back for another pass. Of course, if you're feeling yourself, you can intentionally delay entering the portal to keep shooting down enemy ships, until you don't want to risk any more energy. And speaking of, the 2 weapon options do add a bit of strategy to your play. The lasers use 10 energy per shot versus 1 per torpedo. So if your aim is very good, you can cut a path through your foes pretty handily, but at that cost, every missed shot or damage taken is incredibly painful. Once you're below 10 energy, your weapon automatically reverts to torpedoes, which is a nice feature, but by that point you're probably in trouble. I think this option is probably handier in the 2-player co-op mode where the gunner can actively shift which weapon system they're using based on circumstances, while solo, it's basically just a handicap. As for the 2-player versus mode, it's an interesting concept that I don't think has really been seen since RCA's Studio 3 Star Wars game, but I'm not sure it works particularly well here. As I mentioned, Star Voyager made its debut at the Winter CES show alongside Trick Shot and Demon Attack, but it was overshadowed by a game Activision was debuting at the show as well, Alan Miller's Star Master. Star Master is also a first-person space game in the vein of Star Raiders, but much more closely resembles Atari's computer game with a star map, space stations to defend, and different types of ship damage. A single-line resolution scale, no less, which left Smith thoroughly abashed. In the months following Star Master's own June release, other companies published their own takes on Star Raiders, including Starpath and Atari itself, leaving Star Voyager looking increasingly long in the tooth shortly after its debut. Smith said Imagic ended up making too many Star Voyager copies, and remembered being approached by some Australian dealers at a later CES, complaining about how they had to eat the cost on his game, though as the programmer there wasn't much he could do about it. According to Smith, the game sold less than 1 million copies, though he wasn't sure what the actual number ended up being. On the Video Game Update's end-of-year sales chart, Star Voyager was their 8th best-selling home video game of 1982, behind Defender but ahead of their 2 hottest in television games, Demon Attack, which had just come out a couple months prior, and Star Strike. Still, Smith did return to the idea of a first-person, or at least behind-the-ship space game a few more times, such as the home conversion of Star Wars the arcade game to the VCS, Moonsweeper, and the Super NES game Warp Speed. This said, Star Voyager did seem positively received in the press. Electronic Games remarked that its audio-visual appeal kept it right in line with Imagic's other initial offerings, and that while it may not have the strategic scope of other titles like Star Master or Star Raiders, the action-oriented approach taken by Smith keeps this an exciting and challenging game that may be easier to manage for those who can't quite wrap their head around star maps. Logical Gamer once again splits in their opinions. One reviewer considered it tremendous fun, while the other felt like the player just doesn't have enough to do with their ship, and that the game would likely be found lacking compared to later titles in the same style. Computer and Video Games in the UK also reviewed the game ahead of its September debut in that territory, dubbing it an addictive challenge that combines popular computer space game ideas to produce a challenging package. Joystick's December 1982 special edition gave Star Voyager a short blurb, indicating that it should be more appealing to more aggressive and less strategic players than games like Star Master. Anusco noted that the game's big weakness is that it has a set-top score that cannot be surpassed once reached. Trick Shot by Dennis Koble is something of a rarity for this era of video games, an attempt at bringing the table game pool, also known as pocket billiards, to a home console. While sports games have been a stumbling block for a number of these early game machines due to the number of players and the complexity of strategy to bear in mind, pool is tricky for another reason. It's a game built entirely around physics. At its core, the game is about knocking specific balls into the pockets along the table, which requires taking geometry, physics, spin, and power all into account. It's a remarkably tricky task to ask of a CPU at the time. It's this physics problem that appears to have drawn programmers to the game from the earliest days of computing, a bronze age of computer games known mostly through court depositions today. One of the very first video games recorded includes a pool game developed by William George Brown and Ted Lewis at the University of Michigan using its Michigan Digital Special Automatic Computer, or MIDSAC, with development starting the summer of 1953 before concluding in early 1954. According to a deposition by Brown in the Magnavox v. Bally lawsuit in 1977, the game was written as a demonstration for a professional group out of Detroit. He believed it was the Association for Computing Machinery, but wasn't positive. While a lost program today, a simulation of its operation has been published online based on photos and play descriptions in court depositions. This MIDSAC pool is graphically primitive, with the actual pool table and pockets drawn on the 13-inch XY display with a grease pen. But by all accounts, it was quite playable. The cue was maneuvered on screen and lined up for shots using dials and the equivalent of an analog joystick. The MIDSAC would calculate how all the balls would move, and remove any that enter one of the pockets. If the cue ball went into the pocket, there was a button that would bring it back to the table. Brown said the pool game's sole demonstration took place in June 1954, with pool selected due to the game's similarities to the MIDSAC's true but classified purpose, military guidance systems. Regardless of why it was made, this was the first in a surprising sequence of computerized pool games from this era of computing. Pool reappeared in 1966 and 67. First up, there was Information Display Incorporated, or IDI's, version of Pool, which used its new light pen and display terminal. This was written on a DDP 116 by John Drumheller, who had just written a demo program of balls bouncing around on screen when his employer, Adams Associates, was approached by IDI about making a pool game as a demonstration for their displays. Featuring 15 balls, 2-player action, and the ability to put English on your shots, the game debuted at the Joint Computer Conference in San Francisco that fall. Drumheller, by all accounts, had considered making a consumer retail version of his game that used a standard television, but this never panned out. The next year, RC engineers Larry French and Alfred Tager developed their own computer pool game for the Spectra 70 computer, which happened to be equipped with an IDI light pen terminal as well. When I spoke to French, he said they were tasked by their boss, Dr. Morton Lewin, to do something interactive for the Sarnoff Labs' then upcoming 25th anniversary open house using the terminal. They came up with a pool simulation, which was tricky with the hardware. The Spectra 70 had to be expanded to a full 32 kilobytes of memory, and lacking a floating point math function, the pair had to write one into the program's software. There was no spin or angular momentum, French said, but assuming every collision was centered, the physics engine mimicked reality. Tager developed the routines for using the light pen as a cue stick, which would measure the momentum and angles the player had as they hit the cue ball. Friction was also adjustable from anywhere between frictionless gliding and slogging your ball through molasses. The game was popular at the open house and continued to be shown off for the next few years whenever visitors came through the Sarnoff Labs. Pool finally found its way into a commercial video game in 1976 with Video Pool by US Billiards, followed by Atari's Pool Shark the following year. In 1981, Magnavox managed to bring the game to home consoles with Pocket Billiards for the Odyssey 2, which featured 8-ball, where players compete to sink the 8-ball first, and Rotation, where players must sink all the balls of one of two colors before their opponent. The cue handling is reasonable for the attempt, but the rather awkward physics for how the balls themselves move and interact suggests that there were some hardware limitations going on here. The following year, it was Imagic that stepped up next with Trick Shot. During the 2016 Portland Retro Gaming Expo about Imagic, Koble explained that his group of former Atari developers were incredibly disciplined and that after 3 months they found that they had each developed 3 games. Our first show was a little 10 by 12 booth, Koble said, and unlike Full Up, he saw Imagic's rivalry as being with Activision. More specifically, he said they wanted to pull off tricks on the VCS that made Activision developers wonder how they did it to get bragging rights. Koble told me in an email he hadn't been exposed to any of these earlier attempts at pool, nor does he remember what inspired him to make one for the VCS, except knowing going into it that it would be a challenge given the limited memory and video capabilities of the platform. In his 2017 interview, Koble said that while he was the manager of Atari software development at Imagic, he didn't want to just be limited to overseeing his staff, and so programmed several games himself. With Trick Shot, he said he had trouble getting the physics to work on the VCS, unsurprisingly given the console's limitations, which bothered him since he had a minor in physics during his college days. He ended up having to approximate what the balls would do in a collision rather than program in an actual physics engine. Mechanically, Trick Shot features what you'd want out of a pool game. You use the joystick to rotate your cue around the cue ball, similar to Magnavox's game. Once you're lined up where you want, you hold down the red button on the controller to prepare your shot. The longer you hold it, the more powerful your shot will be, with 5 seconds being a max power strike. You can also put English or spin on the ball by pushing the joystick in a direction while holding down the shot button. The amount of English you put on the ball is determined by how long you're pushing on the joystick, with maximum spin occurring around 7 seconds. It's possible to accidentally rip the felt of the pool table, which results in a tearing sound effect, a cute touch added by Koble with too much forward or reverse spin on a shot. Due to hardware limitations, Trick Shot does not feature a full rack of balls on the table. You have 3 target balls and the cue ball. To make up for this, there are 14 game variations on the cartridge, largely centered around 3 game modes: Trick Shot, Pool, and English Billiards. Trick Shot is the meat of the cartridge, where the player attempts 9 different scenarios where the balls are placed in specific arrangements. You have 1 shot per scenario to sink as many of the balls as possible, ideally all 3. You get 1 point per target ball sunk, plus a 2-point bonus if you manage to knock them all in. The cartridge includes practice modes for all 9 scenarios to allow players plenty of opportunity to learn the tables. In 2-player modes, each player alternates on each scenario, with the winner being whoever gets the most points at the end. Koble elaborated on this game mode in our emails, noting that it came about because of the VCS's limitations. Since it was impossible to fit all of the math necessary to implement a general pool game and all collisions needed to be approximated, there are actually very few angles the ball could travel and impact other balls even semi-correctly. With this in mind, Koble could create pre-planned shot setups that were guaranteed to work every time, as long as the player could find the correct angle to execute the shot. As he put it, it was not actually a real-life simulation, but it was made to look as if it was. Pool mode is functionally standard pool, but with 3 balls. You get 5 racks of 3 balls apiece, and play follows the standard rules. You retain control of the board as long as you sink a ball, but if you scratch and sink the cue ball or fail to knock any of the target balls in, control shifts to the other player, if you're playing a 2-player game. Each ball is worth 1 point, plus a 2-point bonus for sinking the last ball in a rack. Once a rack is completed, the balls are reset on the table. In both 1 and 2-player modes, the game ends at 25 points, with the winner in the latter being whoever hit the score. The difficulty switches come into play here, adjusting the cue ball scratch rules. Finally, there is the 2-player only English Billiards mode. This features a dizzying array of rules on the table with 2 cue balls, 1 for each player, and a red target ball. You earn points by knocking your opponent's cue into a pocket, by knocking the target ball in, pocketing your own ball if it bounced off either the red ball or the opponent's cue ball, and footing both balls with your own cue ball. Whoever reaches 50 points first wins the game. Credit where it's due, the ball physics feel right in this game, and being able to add spin to the balls brings an additional layer of complexity that is quite welcome. The Trick Shot puzzle levels are quite tricky to solve successfully. My best score was pretty paltry. So for pool aficionados, this is very likely a cool game mode. The standard pool does the best it can with the ball limitations, and English Billiards is an incredibly wild take on the game that I really had never seen before this cartridge. On the flip side, while you ostensibly have 32 positions to shoot from, it's extremely difficult to align a shot just how you want it, and much like real pool, you'll be extremely irritated when you either just whiff the target, or it simply bounces harmlessly around the corners of the pocket. This is a game for a very specific audience, and while there's still fun to be had here if you're not a big pool fan, particularly if you have a second player, I can understand why this is more of a niche title for Imagic. Perhaps unsurprisingly for a game about pool, Trick Shot was not as widely reviewed as Demon Attack or Star Voyager. TV Gamer wrote in their blurb that while the graphics are good, the sound effects were underwhelming. Meanwhile, Rawson Stovall wrote in his book, The Vid Kids Book of Home Video Games, that Trick Shot was very popular with his father, speaking positively about the table-ripping sound effect on a shot with too much English. The British Computer and Video Games, issue dated September 1982, reviewed Trick Shot, noting that the plethora of Trick Shot challenges and the convincing ball movement, but adds that the pocket sizes being so large makes it too easy for a miss-hit shot to count. Joystick advised people not to pass by Trick Shot in its little blurb. Meanwhile, Timonosko mentioned that despite only having 4 balls on screen, the different challenges and game types were very good and that the cartridge was the next best thing to having a real pool table, though the action may be a bit slow-paced for hardcore video game players. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz reviewed the game in Video Magazine and wrote that it belonged in every cartridge library as the finest pool game available on consoles. While the VCS's memory limitations hamper Trick Shot, they said it was nevertheless an excellent game that looked and sounded good, and one that tested extremely well with women on their end. Trick Shot appears to have been one of the games Imagic issued a rebate offer for at the end of December through March 1983. This was right when the market crash was occurring and suggests that Trick Shot's sales had slowed and that this was Imagic's attempt to move product a bit more. Some stores had it, and Star Voyager targeted with coupons for the holiday season too, such as the Meijer department store chain. We don't have sales numbers for Trick Shot, but this does suggest it was not a particularly hot seller. Certainly not compared to Demon Attack anyway, and that in turn likely explains why there were no more console pool games until the NES came along. Even the Intellivision's own pool game Deep Pockets failed to reach shelves in 1990. On the other hand, Koble said that he recalls Trick Shot selling fairly well alongside Star Voyager, just nowhere near Demon Attack, so maybe ultimately the lack of additional pool games just came back to that old enemy of early game consoles: physics calculations. Much like Activision, Imagic also offered prizes for people who could clear certain scores, called the Expert Club. Early on, this was a simple gold star sticker that they could attach to their cartridge, but starting in 1983, earning 100,000 points in Demon Attack, 35 kills in Star Voyager, or 37 points in Trick Shot would earn a player an Iron-On Award decal, with additional prizes for reaching the targets in multiple games. Imagic's founding was a catalyst that affected change at Atari too. Following Fulop Smith and Koble's departure to form their own company, Pac-Man developer Todd Fry's threatened departure and the overall unruliness of the consumer division's programming staff, the company instituted a royalty program for VCS cartridges. Developers received a percentage of the sales, which is what allowed Fry to become a millionaire following his success with Pac-Man. While Atari's staff still didn't get name recognition on their games like those at Activision and Imagic were, they were, at the least, getting a nice little bonus that was better than a turkey coupon. On the strength of these 3 games and their successive releases for both the VCS and the Intellivision, Imagic would quickly gain a reputation as one of the strongest publishers for home consoles in this era, to the point where even now, that oftentimes silver label is a sign of quality. The company may have ultimately been a victim of the market crash, but its developers were true masters of the hardware, as we'll see time and again. Next time, Activision beats Atari to the Defender game.